Okay, my little clock on the wall says it's 6 o'clock, 7 p.m. So the little birdie tells me it is time to get started. Welcome. My name is Katie Kalidas, and as I just said a second ago, I'm the Director of Research and Content at the National Hellenic Museum in Chicago, Illinois. And you are here for All Roads Lead to Byzantium, the spice routes in the Byzantine Empire. This is part of our Spice Month, which is a collaboration with celebrity chef, the host of My Greek Table, Diane Kuchelis. And I know that many of you joined us here after seeing her talk about this on her social media. So we are so glad to have you, and we hope that this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. NHM Discussions is sponsored by the Hellenic Foundation. Everything we do at NHM is because of our community partners and because of the generous support of people like you. And at the end, if you're so moved, I'm going to tell you how you can become part of the NHM family. But without, a couple of things, some housekeeping about tonight. First, we're recording tonight's session to put on our YouTube. We know that there's interest in this topic from people all over the world and across the United States. We know that people have things to do on Tuesday nights, and we want to make sure that we can share this with as many people as possible. But rest assured, the only person whose name and face is going to be on the internet is mine, and that's what I signed up for. If you do have a question, this is in webinar format, so you can ask that in the Q&A box. Because there are so many of you this evening, which is a good problem to have, I'm going to answer questions at the end of each section, just so that we can keep some flow and I'm not flipping back and forth too much, which is not a pleasant experience for you. Are there any questions about those sort of housekeeping things? Okay, I promise not to put your face on the internet, just my face. Poor internet. So thank you so much for being here. When we were thinking of ways to start our collaboration with Diane, I started to think about all the ways, we started to think about all the ways that food is the way people encounter Greek culture for the first time, and also the ways that food is sort of the way that all of us interact with culture in any given moment, right? So for many people, the first time they encounter Greek culture is in a Greek restaurant. And for those of us, many of us from Greek backgrounds in the diaspora who were born and raised outside of Greece, Greek food is the most salient way we stay connected to our culture, right? To our Greek heritage. And so food is always present, and food is a part of cultures. And when you study the foods people eat, you can learn so much about them, right? When we study food culture, when you study what a people eat, you're not just studying food, right? You're studying what resources they have access to. You're studying what they value, right? So there's laws of kosher, there's dietary restrictions, vegetarian dietary restrictions, there's periods of feasting and fasting in a religion, right? Food is also about what we value. And you can tell who they're trading with, how they're trading, and nothing encapsulates this story more than spices. Now, as we're going to learn tonight, spices have other uses than culinary ones, but they're so, so important, particularly in the period we're talking about today. So, most important spices, are not indigenous to the Mediterranean. Mastic is an exception. There's exceptions, obviously, but most spices are not indigenous to the Eastern Mediterranean. The spice capitals of the world are really in Asia, in India, in China, in Nepal. These are where most spice plants are indigenous. So if you have spices in Europe, in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Asia Minor, it's because you're trading with people. Now, we know that people had discovered spices 8,000 years ago. By 8,000 years ago, people are using spices. They're using it in their cooking, and they're using it in their religious services, and they're using it as medicine. So as we talked this evening about the importance of spices, it's not just about making tasty dishes. That's part of it, right? Like food without spices, food without salt, especially ancient food that oftentimes was rotting or not so quite so good at certain points in certain periods. Food before refrigeration without spices was particularly bad. It's important, but that's not the only thing. Spices have medicinal uses, and spices have always had religious uses as well. This is pretty obvious why it would have religious uses if you really think about it. Like the things you offer to the gods are things that are valuable to you. So this in front of you is an icon. Yes, you are muted. Okay, sorry about that. This in front of you is the Byzantine icon of the presentation of the Magi, the adoration of the Magi. We're in the Advent season, we're in the Christmas season, and you hear songs about we three kings, the story of the wise men from the east coming to worship the Christ child. Tradition tells us that the gifts they brought were frankincense, gold, and myrrh. Everybody knows the song, right? Bring him incense, gold, and myrrh. And you might have long thought to yourself, that's a weird gift for infants, right? Why didn't they bring them diapers or bottles or formula? Those things weren't invented yet, but you get the gist. Why were these the things they bring? They brought them because, so, and by the way, 2 out of these three things are spices, right? So you have in front of you, we have frankincense starting on my left. We have frankincense, gold, myrrh. Why were these the things they brought? You're not, when you read that story, when you hear that tradition, you're not supposed to think those were actual gifts, right? That's not supposed to be taken literally. If you had lived in the 1st century CE, if you were among the first listeners of these stories, you would immediately know what these things meant. You would know that frankincense is what you offered to the gods. Frankincense in Greco-Roman in the Greco-Roman tradition, in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, frankincense is what was burned to the gods. It's still used today, by the way, in Orthodox and Catholic and Anglican, some high church Lutherans. In any church where they burn incense, what they're burning is frankincense, for the most part. Gold, this is our non-spice product. Gold is what you give to kings. It's how you pay tribute to kings. And myrrh is used to anoint the bodies of the dead. This tradition, so you see this in the mummification of bodies in Egypt. When we look at human remains from the Greco-Roman period, there's traces of myrrh. This survives today in Orthodox, Catholic, Anglican traditions. The chrism oil contains myrrh. So the oil they use after you've been baptized as a baby or when you're received into the church, that contains myrrh. When they anoint the bodies of the dead, they anoint them with myrrh. Myrrh is associated with the dead. If you think ahead to the Easter story, we talk about the myrrh-bearing women, the women who brought myrrh to the tomb of Christ. That's what you give to the dead. And so in the ancient world, if you had heard this story, you'd have known what these things meant, and you would have known that they were trying to say things about who the Christ child was, right? So frankincense, because Christ is God. Gold, because Christ is king. And myrrh, because he had come to die. This is the power of spices, right? These are just spices. These are just plant resin. These are just resin from plants, and yet they have all this weight and symbolic meaning. And because they have all this weight and symbolic meaning, they're valuable to people. They're economically valuable, and they can also communicate all of this rich imagery, right? They can tell you, they have theological significance because of this, right? Okay. You also think about something like mastic. This is there's a great, I did a great interview with Diane Cuchellis, not because of me, because of her, absolutely brilliant, where she talked about mastic, the queen of spices. It's native, it's one of the few spices that's native to the Eastern Mediterranean. It's native to the island of Chios. You can go check that out on the NHM YouTube channel. And you can hear Diane talk about mastic and all of its uses, many of which are medicinal, right? These have value outside of culinary value. And it's because of this plethora of uses that spice has had that they became so valuable. And because they became so valuable, because they were so useful, much of the history, not only of the Byzantine Empire, but of the world is tied up in the trade in spices. So, if we want to talk about the Byzantine spice trade, we have to talk about the Roman spice trade. And right here, I'm going to pause for a second and see if there's any questions. Okay. I'm not the first person to tell you this. I won't be the last person to tell you this. But when you think of this, I would like you to think of me. There was no such thing as the Byzantine Empire. Nobody uttered the words Byzantine Empire until 100 years after the empire was gone. The Byzantine Empire, what we call the Byzantine Empire, was the Eastern Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire survived. The Western Empire fell, thank you, Will Durant, right? The collapse of Rome. And that was a joke just for the classics nerds out there. The Eastern Roman Empire, the Greek-speaking half of the empire, survived. And there's many scholars right now who are sort of encouraging us to drop the term Byzantium. Some people are saying Eastern Roman Empire. Some people are talking about the Greek Middle Ages. But regardless, the important part is that what we call the Byzantine Empire was the Eastern Roman Empire. And so to understand the Byzantine spice trade, the Eastern Roman spice trade, you have to understand the spice trade before the empire, the Western half of the empire fell. And what we know is that by the 1st and 2nd century CE, at the height of Roman power, there is an incredible amount of trade going on between Asia and the Roman Empire in spices, probably more than we imagined, because you have to remember how hard it was to travel, how hard it was to travel really before the railroad, which is only about 250 some odd years old, right? Math's not great, 230 years old. So for most people who've ever lived, ever died, have lived and died within a 20-mile radius of where they were born. So if you think about the scale of this trade that's taking people from the Mediterranean all the way to the Pacific Ocean, it's epic, and it's much more extensive than we appreciated for many years. And archaeology is actually increasingly finding evidence that this trade was much more extensive and much wider reaching than we imagined. So what's in front of you right now is actually a shipwreck off the coast of southern France near Marseille, which is, of course, originally founded as a Greek colony. But I'll tell you, there are lots of shipwrecks in the Mediterranean, like lots and lots of shipwrecks. People have been sailing around there for a long time. But this shipwreck is important because this is a Chinese vessel. This vessel came from Imperial China, and it was off the coast of Western France in the 2nd century CE. That's incredible. And we know by scraping the resin, by looking at the bowls that have fallen to the bottom of the ocean, you can see some of the debris there at the upper part of the picture. We know that it was carrying spices. This ship in particular, it looks like was carrying largely cinnamon and cloves, but it was carrying spices. And so think about what that means, how far that would have been to travel, probably up through the Gulf, the Arabian Gulf. But think how far that was. It probably took years, decades. There are no smartphones, there are no telegrams, there's not even a reliable postal service of any kind. People would set sail on these voyages and not be heard from literally for a decade, right? Like, think about that. It's absolutely incredible. They were doing it because this was a profitable trade. Another example of this is the Salpool tapestry. This is a very fragmented tapestry from the Qing province of China, which is in northeastern China, near modern day Beijing. And the reason this is significant is it appears, you can see this man here, it appears this man is dressed in Hellenistic garb. Now we know there were some Hellenistic kingdoms, some Greek kingdoms that are descended from Alexander the Great in Nepal, but this is significant because this tapestry seems to show Roman and Greek soldiers in it. This is roughly the equivalent. This was actually in the 1st century BCE, so even 100 years, 200 years older than that shipwreck. And this is really significant. This is sort of like if, I mean, when you think about just the distance this is, it's sort of like someone handed you a picture from, of aliens on Mars, and in that picture there were American soldiers. This is how far apart and sort of unknown and mysterious. We're going to talk about why that's good and bad. This was, but these soldiers were captured as part of a battalion. We think we know who these soldiers are, by the way, now. And they were captured as part of a battalion accompanying spice merchants to the east. These relationships continued and strengthened. And so when we get into the 4th and 5th centuries CE, the period when we really stop talking about the Roman Empire, start talking about the Byzantine Empire, this is what the trade routes would have looked like. And I'm going to stop here and ask if there are any questions. None? Okay, great. So if you look at these trade routes, one thing you'll notice, or you should notice, is that these are primarily water trade routes. Silk, you might have heard about the Silk Road. Everybody's heard about the Silk Road. The Silk Road was an overland trade route. Most spices were traded on the sea. It was a maritime trade largely. And this is going to be significant going forward. So we're going to talk about in a few hundred years, that's going to be very important. This is largely a maritime trade route. So if you look at this map in 530 of the Roman trade routes that are bringing spices to Italy, bringing spices into the Roman Empire, one thing you'll notice is that Constantinople, Byzantium, which at that time is called Byzantium, Constantinople, because 530 it's already Constantinople. Constantinople is largely cut out of the trade, right? It's really not part of the spice route at this point. Most of the spices are coming through Egypt. The Roman province that is acting as the gateway to these spice markets is Egypt. Egypt had a long, long history of spice traders, really going back to the Bronze Age. The wealth of the pharaohs, in no small part, was built on the spice trade. And so Egypt had this long, long history and maintained that supremacy. And so these ships would sail oftentimes from China, around the coast of India, through the Arabian Gulf, and then up into Egypt. And then that was Egypt, of course, had Alexandria, which was the port that led out onto the Mediterranean. And this was an important source of spices, right? This is how the spice trade was done for hundreds and hundreds of years. And then 3 very important things happen in fairly quick succession that changes all of that. By the way, this is just, I said this tapestry. This tapestry was sent actually to the Emperor Theodosius in the 5th century by the Emperor of China. They didn't really know who each other was, right? They didn't really know who the other one was. They had these vague ideas of who the other one was, but he sends him these greetings that are brought through these middlemen. He knows there's an emperor in the east somewhere, just like in the west somewhere, just like the Byzantine emperor knows that there's this emperor in this powerful kingdom in the east, and he sends his greetings. And so this piece, this tapestry, is actually something we found in Ephesus. We found in Asia Minor. So, and it's got Greek writing on the back, which is cool. Okay, so think about these trade routes again, right? So what are the things that happen that cause these, fairly stable routes to change? Well, there's 3 really key things. First, the Byzantines suffer a horrible defeat at the end of the 6th century against the Saracen Empire, what's really the Persian Empire of its day. They suffered pretty substantial defeat, and this is the first major loss of Eastern territory for the Byzantines. This seriously disrupts their access to key ports along the Black Sea and along the southern Arab Gulf, right? Arabian Gulf. It's a huge loss. And it also, by the way, it also disrupts these overland trade routes that are they're bringing silk. It reorients, it starts to reorient the Byzantine trading, the Byzantine trading routes. The other thing that happens, I'm actually going to start here first. The other thing that happens is that the Gupta Empire of India, this massive empire that had ruled most of northern India and also key spice territory, key silk territory for 1,000 years, falls to the Huns. This is catastrophic, right? This is absolutely catastrophic. All of the sort of old power that had kept these routes in place is displaced, and the region is plunged into a significant period of upheaval, which means crops aren't planted. Spices are plants. And when crops aren't planted, when people aren't stable, and people aren't able to tend and harvest the crops and dry the spices, the trade gets disrupted. It gets disrupted significantly. This is happening in the early 7th century. The other thing that's happening in the early 7th century and moving through the 7th century into the 8th is the founding of Islam and the rise of the first Islamic empires, the caliphates. This map in front of you kind of shows how quickly the caliphate expanded over this period of really less than 150 years. Not only did it claim all of the Sassanian Empire, right, all of the former Persian Empire, but huge tracts of the Western Byzantine Empire. And it also, parts of North Africa, parts of Spain that had been part of the Roman Empire. All of this, by the way, except for, Arabia and what's Persia had been part of the Roman Empire. It's all claimed by the advancing armies of the Caliphate. But perhaps most significant, two places are most significant in this period of takeover, in this period of conquest, in this period of conquest. One is the Arabian Peninsula. The tribes of the Arabian Peninsula are united. Part of what had allowed the spice trade to flourish in the way it had in antiquity and in the early Middle Ages is the tribes of Arabia were always at war with each other. They were always competing with each other. And that left the port cities in some way open for foreign merchants to come and go really unfettered. But the minute the Arabian tribes are united, they start, and there's this empire that's organized and has a central government, they start controlling those port routes in much more significant ways than had ever been done before. And this makes the whole adventure much, much more expensive, quite frankly. The other significant loss, you're probably looking at it right now, the other significant loss is Egypt. Egypt falls to the armies of the Caliph in 640 CE, which means Alexandria falls to the armies of the Caliph. It is a devastating loss. It is an absolutely devastating loss. And what's really interesting is how quickly this was allowed to happen. And one of the sort of questions of history is why the Byzantine Empire, why the Eastern Roman Empire didn't respond sooner to the rise of Islam. Not for religious reasons, by the way, but for geopolitical reasons. Why didn't they sense that there was this threat, right? Why didn't they don't really actually start? It's really not until the middle of the 7th century, as they start taking territory in the Levant, in modern day Syria, in modern day Israel, Palestine, in modern day Jordan, that the Byzantines start to respond. And this is one of the kind of, I think, great questions of the early Byzantine period, the early late antique period. Well, there's a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is religious. There had been a number of, there's no non-pejorative term, I suppose, heretical, schismatic, non-Chalcedonian, let's call them non-Chalcedonian groups, Christians, that had emerged, particularly on the eastern edge of the empire. So it was not uncommon for there to be preachers, prophets, priests, bishops in this period, even 300 years after the Council of Nicaea, going around talking about Jesus was a prophet, but he wasn't divine. Jesus was a messenger, but he wasn't divine. That the denial of Christ's divinity as a kind of standard part of religious discourse was very common. And so when people back in Constantinople hear about, when the bishops back in Constantinople, when the bishops in Alexandria, in Antioch, hear about this man in the Arabian Peninsula preaching essentially from the Jewish and Christian scriptures, but saying that there is this, that Christ is not divine and that he's the final prophet, they actually don't think much of it. They don't see this as an innovative or new, they don't see the potential that this is a different, new kind of religious movement. What awakens them to this reality are two things. One, Muhammad just doesn't stop at his theological propositions. He offers a new set of law, the Sharia, right? The Quran doesn't just outline theological propositions, it offers all sorts of law. It's similar to the Hebrew scriptures in this way. It tells people how to live and how to govern themselves. And some of the ways it tells people how to live and how to govern themselves is in contradiction to Roman law. So that's the first thing they know. There's lots of, Arius, Nestor, there's lots of these sort of people, there's lots of preachers who deny the divinity of, there's lots of, preachers and prophets who deny the divinity of Christ in this period. Not many of them say, also Roman law is bad and I have a different law for you. The second is they start to realize not as under Muhammad, but as the advancing Muslim armies start to take shape, and a little bit under Muhammad as he unites the tribes, they start to realize that this is going to be a huge disruptor of trade, including the spice trade. So if there's questions. Asia Minor, Greece, and Italy are absolutely participating in trade. I'm sorry that wasn't clear. Yeah, so they are buying their spices out of Alexandria. So yeah, just to be clear, the reason we point out Alexandria is sort of the clearinghouse where all the goods are coming, and then people are they're being bought by merchants and being distributed throughout the rest of the empire, through Asia Minor, through Greece, through Italy. Even as far north as the Germanic tribes, the Vikings, who are also sailing down to Constantinople, the Kievan Rus are buying spices. Yeah, there's a very rich trade around this, but Alexandria is acting as the clearinghouse until it's taken by the armies of the Caliphate in 641. Other questions? Oh, that's a great question. We're going to do a little bit. Flora, if you can hold your question, I have a whole Nabatean section. At least clear some of these great questions tonight. I'll move over my notes. Okay. Are there any other questions? I hope I haven't missed anybody. So yeah, this is the sort of state of affairs. So this is the real disruptors. These things happen in pretty quick succession. And I would argue, so this is a Katie Kaulitis, theory, not so much what was I gonna say? It's a Katie Kaulitis theory, if nothing else. But the one that we call this period, by the way, in Western kind of traditional Western historiography, we call this period the Dark Ages. And I would argue, right, that the reason we call it that, the reason we associate this period with darkness, with badness, is because it is this period of drastic upheaval and sort of a world order that had prevailed. It's really part of the fallout, right, of the Christianization of the Roman Empire, etc. And the world order that really prevailed since the Bronze Age, right, since Homer, was coming apart, was coming undone. And Christianity and Islam were part of that, by the way, right? We're part of this upheaval, the displacement of the old religions. But also there's these huge political upheavals happening as well. And this is very, very important. Now, also, and I promised Flora this, the Nabatean kingdom, which was sort of, I don't know if you can see my pointer, so it's a kingdom right in here that controlled a lot of around Damascus. I'm not doing a very good job pointing around Damascus, which would control many of the spice routes. This is kind of an important like side note, which would control many of the spice routes in sort of the pre-Roman period, before Rome took the Levant. Many of those people, right? The kingdom is destroyed, but the people are still there, and the people are also involved in the spice trade. And as the sort of part of what helps the advancing armies of the caliphate is they're treated really badly by the Romans. They're treated really badly by the Greeks. And so they sort of switch side. They're easy to get on side with the advancing, they're sort of ethnically Arab. They have, and they're offered a better deal. They're basically told, if you convert to Islam, you can be a full citizen in this empire. You can be treated, you can have this sort of better treatment than you've had under the Romans. And so that also, right, this empire that grew rich in the spice trade, these people who had maintained their relevance because of the spice trade, they kind of helped those advancing armies as well. See, Flora, I promised. Are there any other questions? Okay, so the world has been turned upside down. And one might argue, that the world that's being created in this moment is the world that persists until the Archduke Hans Ferdinand gets shot, the Industrial Revolution, right? So, are there any questions? Okay, so a couple of things happen as a result of this. The first thing that happens is that the gateway of spices into Europe, into the Greco-Roman world, what's left of it, even into Western Europe, right? North to the Kievan Rus, into the Rus kingdoms, to the Viking kingdoms. That route moves, that place, that dispatch place for the Roman Empire moves from Alexandria to Constantinople. This is a huge economic boon for Constantinople, which had become a political capital, but was still sort of behind in terms of its tech capacity, right? In terms of its place as an economic capital. And a spice market is established at Constantinople, the descendant of which you can still visit to this day. I have a picture for you at the end. The other thing is that it becomes clear that kind of safe water route through the Arabian Gulf, kind of hugging, if you looked at those, I'll show you, I don't want to give anyone whiplash, but if you look at those sea routes, these really hug the coast, right? These are very safe as sailing, maritime goes. These are very safe routes. It becomes increasingly clear that that is not going to be an option. I'll show you on the map here. And so people start thinking about sailing east is becoming less and less of an option. How can we get to those spice growing countries? How can we get to India? How can we get to China by sailing west? And this is a boon. Well, a couple things. This is a boon in maritime technology. It also drives the price of spices through the roof. Spices had always been expensive, but as come into the Middle Ages, there is a real boon in the price of spices. And I just want to talk about two particular spices you probably have in your cabinet right now, to sort of illustrate this point. The first is, behold, the humble peppercorn. In the Middle Ages, so black pepper, is grown in the Kerala region of Southeast India. And in the Middle Ages, the price of pepper boomed. It became harder to get, and the price of it was driven up exponentially. Its taste, particularly over rotten meat, many have hypothesized is important. We add pepper, basically salt and pepper to everything, right? That's spicing your food. People also, so pepper becomes incredibly, incredibly expensive very quickly in the Middle Ages. In fact, it becomes so expensive that at one point it is pricier than gold, right? It's worth more than gold. Charlemagne asked for taxes to be paid to him in pepper, not in gold, right? So he tried to extract pepper from people, not from gold, when he was going to collect taxes. It was incredibly valuable. The other spice that had this similar phenomenon happen to it is from Ceylon, from Sri Lanka, what is today Sri Lanka, and that is cinnamon. The source of cinnamon was actually a really well-guarded secret by the spice traders. And really beginning with Herodotus, we have people being like, this stuff is so good, I wonder where it comes from. You can go through all sorts of, you can read all sorts of testimonies to this. Well, the Arab traders found the source. They found Sri Lanka, they found the source of cinnamon. And once they found the source of cinnamon in Indonesia and Sri Lanka, they were able to control the trade, because remember, no one else knew where it was. And we're going to talk here in a little minute, we're going to talk here in a minute about the sort of European effort to find a way around the Arab caliphate, to find a way around the caliphate to get to spices. But this secret of cinnamon was very closely guarded. And in fact, it wasn't until the 14th century that Europeans figured out where cinnamon was from. And so the price of cinnamon was incredibly high, not as high as pepper, but it was incredibly high, incredibly rare. And we even have, this is going into the early modern period, we have like Elizabethan and Jacobean cookbooks where people say things like, you know, like on the Queen's table, you can put cinnamon in this, but nowhere else. The only person who can afford cinnamon at certain points is our royalty, right? And you've got giant jars of it. I was looking just over there. I have a giant jar of cinnamon just laying out on my counter. No thought to it. Questions about cinnamon or peppercorn? If we decide to bring it back, I got some real money coming to me. Okay, so that's Indonesia. Okay. So what are the options? What do we do? Well, one thing that we can do is we can turn to the Ethiopian kingdom. And this is really the first effort that's made to reclaim some control of the spice trade and get spices back into Europe in the way that they had come before these three events. So Ethiopia is a fascinating place. It was the one part of Africa that was never colonized. And Ethiopia actually resists, is also the part of Eastern Africa that largely is successful in repelling the armies of the caliphate. And so the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions in the world. There's also an ancient Jewish community in Ethiopia as well. Ancient, like before the Bronze Age, ancient Jewish community in Ethiopia as well. And they are the Romans looked to them for a moment as, you know, sort of a fellow Christian empire that might be able to facilitate this spice trade. Unfortunately, Ethiopia is in a lot of trouble as well. And they're fighting, there's this series of civil wars within Ethiopia that quickly make it clear that it is not going to be a reliable source of trade, and it's not going to ever secure the Arabian Gulf as the chief kind of dominant masters of the Arabian Gulf. There's never a significant Ethiopian naval presence, and so that idea quickly is disregarded. This is Abdin Kau, the great Ethiopian emperor, who sort of unites the Ethiopian tribes against the caliphate's invasion. So Ethiopia is not going to come through. What are the options? The option is to get better ships. That's the first option. So if you want to head west, past the Straits of Gibraltar, and somehow get to the spice routes, most people at this point think that you're going to have to sail around the Cape of Africa is the shortest way. just real fast. One of the great myths of history is that people thought the world was flat. That is not true. No one thought the world was flat. The earth looks round. You can like watch things come over the horizon. Ptolemy had calculated the circumference of the earth within like 600 feet, 1,000 years before, basically, give or take. Nobody thought the earth was flat. No one was afraid they were going to sail over the edge. They just thought it was very far, like, right, that it was going to be a very long trek, and there was nothing there. They didn't realize there was a land mass. They didn't think it was flat. So the idea was to sail around the Cape of Africa. But if you're going to do that, you need ships that can be out in the open ocean. And that is a very different kind of ship and a very different kind of naval technology than the naval technology that you need to hug the coast and go through the Arabian Gulf. And so what we see in the Middle Ages, in the late early to mid Middle Ages, is the rise of these maritime republics, predominantly in Italy, but in the late Middle Ages, predominantly in Italy, but also eventually in Spain and Portugal. And the two very important ones in the Middle Ages, in the late Middle Ages, are Genoa and Venice. By the 12th century, 13th century, Genoa and Venice have become very, very rich because they've acquired sailing capacity that not only has made them able to withstand, to seek out these different trading routes, but also, and to withstand the, just go through the Arabian Peninsula and sort of fight off. They've developed a navy that is second to none. The strength of the Venetian and Genoese navies and their sort of prowess as maritime sailors makes them the masters of Europe. And this is happening at a period in the 11th, 12th, 13th century when the Byzantine Empire is on the decline. Okay. And it is the entry of Genoa and Venice into the Fourth Crusade that deals the first significant blow to the Byzantine Empire. Now, a couple of things. The first three crusades are not horribly successful, let's be clear. And the Fourth Crusade is not super successful if success is, permanently retaking the Holy Land or conquering non-Christian cities. The big success of the Fourth Crusade is that they conquer the Byzantine Empire, right? The Byzantine Empire falls away for a little bit. Parts of the Byzantine Empire are never returned to the Byzantines, even before the Ottoman conquest. But what compels Venice and Genoa to enter the Fourth Crusade? Venice in particular is famously anti-papal. In fact, to this day, if you go to St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice and go to the Mass, you're going to see a different Mass than you'll see anywhere in the Catholic world. It's a famously anti-papal city. Why would they join this? They joined the Fourth Crusade because they were promised that they would have Constantinople and thus the gateway to the spice trade, which is what they had been trying to get all along. The Fourth Crusade has some of the most far-reaching consequences of any event in history. And if you're interested in the history of like the Christian church, the Fourth Crusade is where it's at. We always say, 1056 is the year of the Great Schism. That's when the Roman and East and Greek church split. Yeah, kind of. That's the year of the mutual excommunications of the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Pope. But people were still communing together. Everyday people did not sense that divide. It was the Fourth Crusade, the sack of Constantinople, and the period of rule by Venice that we call the Francocratia in Greek that really solidified that division. Crete, Rhodes, they remained in Venetian hands. They actually fell to the Ottomans from Venice, right? They remained in Venetian hands. These are the that is the effect that happened because Venice and Genoa, but Venice really, were trying to dominate the spice trade. Question. Oops, sorry. Okay, so there's a question if I think that if the mental decline of Heraclius is responsible in part. for his slow response to the to the rise of Islam. Oh dear. Yes, and I think that could be a factor. It's certainly a factor that sort of early modern historiographers looking at the situation note. I am slow to psychoanalyze, diagnose in any way people from the past. I think it could certainly be a factor, and certainly people around the period thought so. Anonymous. Any other questions? Okay, fantastic. Okay, so this is the beginning of the end. By the way, a couple of famous Genoese sailors have a huge impact on the world. One of them is Marco Polo. Let's talk about Marco Polo for a second. Marco Polo goes on his journey looking for spices. He starts his journey in Constantinople, which is sort of the westernmost part of the East in the early modern European mind, and one might argue still today. And Marco Polo's account of his journey to the spice markets of the East become hugely influential. But I'll tell you a secret. Some people now think he never went. He may have been the first like fake blogger of all time. He may have never gone. And one of the reasons we think he may have never gone is that some of his accounts of the places he visited just don't jive with what we know were going on in those places at the time. And he sets the stage for a really important phenomenon that's associated with the spice routes. One that will originally be cultivated by Eastern Romans, and that then they'll eventually be a victim of. They'll first be cultivated by Eastern Romans, but that they'll eventually be a victim of. And this is this sort of exoticization of the East. So, as I mentioned, like cinnamon, no one knew where cinnamon came from. These incredibly valuable, useful things were flowing into Europe, were flowing into the Mediterranean, and they were coming from a place that people couldn't even imagine. The people had no idea where it was, right? Often it was coming through middlemen, so people had never been there themselves, even the traders. And so there started to be these ideas about the wealthy East, all the things that spices were associated with were put on to the East as a whole, right? Wealth, decadence. Some of this is already starting if you read like Herodotus and ideas about the Persian Empire, but spices are a huge part of this. The spice trade keeps this image alive of the sort of decadent East. Edward Said will ultimately call this Orientalism, right? This sort of exoticization of the East. One of the interesting and sort of ironic things, and I'm hoping in the spring we're gonna have someone come talk to us about this. Anthony Kalides, who is a professor at the University of Chicago, has done a bunch of work on this subject. One of the interesting things that happens is that once the Eastern Roman Empire is conquered by the Ottoman Empire, they essentially become part of that exotic East. Greeks essentially become part of that exotic East and have many of the same problems with image that are created in that Orientalist impulse. So stay tuned. We're going to have someone come talk about that in a much more in-depth way. Okay, so one of the things that's happening in this period, the 13th, 12th, 13th, 14th century, 13th century, 12th and 13th century, is there is an empire growing out of the Anatolian Plateau, the center of Turkey, that's becoming more and more powerful. And the way it's becoming more and more powerful is it's seizing control of key ports and trading spots in the spice trade. And this is making it grow rich. And that empire is the Ottoman Empire. And it's the Ottoman Empire, as you all know, that will ultimately conquer and destroy the Eastern Roman Empire. In 1453, on May 29th, according to the old calendar, the armies of Mehmed II come into Constantinople, a city that he has to have not only because of its fame and prestige, its source as the capital of the empire, but because he needs to control the access of spices, of trade routes into Europe, because his goal is not to stop at Constantinople. And remember, the Ottomans come knocking at the door of Budapest initially, and that's where they're finally turned back. So spices, which had enriched the Roman Empire for centuries, are ultimately the thing that also enriched the empire that leads to their conquest. And that is, my friends, how spices have shaped history. In other news, in 1440 years later, a Genoese sailor sailing for the crown of Spain is going to land on San Lucia in the Caribbean. Christopher Columbus will have been sailing under the Spanish crown, the Genoese Christopher Columbus, looking for spices. The modern world is born, and spices, kind of ironically, because of the birth of the modern world, which created the modern world, lose their sort of economic prevalence slowly but surely, to the point that I now have peppercorn and cinnamon sitting on my countertop. Are there any questions? Okay, if you go to Istanbul, to Constantinople, I have good news for you. You can still visit the spice market. It is still there. The site is slightly different, but it is still the site. It has been in continuous operation for 2,000 years, and you can, or for 1,700 years. You can go visit the spice market in Istanbul even today, and it is amazing. It is an amazing experience. One of the top 10 things to do in Istanbul. Oh, so we have one question here. I read Christopher Columbus was Greek, and then he wrote his nocturnal records in Greek. Any thoughts? Here's the thing. Greek identity as such, as it exists today, like citizenship in a nation state or Greek descent, that really takes shape in the Ottoman Empire. I can talk about that at length, but modern Greek identity really takes shape in the Ottoman Empire. Lots of people claim sort of Greekness in the Middle Ages that was associated with linguistic and cultural values. Christopher Columbus was probably ethnically, as we would term it, Italian. But it wouldn't surprise me if he kept nautical records in Greek. Educated people did speak Greek at the time. All the nautical records of his I've seen, though, are written in Genoese. So I don't know. I haven't seen anything. I'm not a Columbus scholar, though, so. Thank you, Maria. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been such a pleasure. Once again, I want to thank Diane Kachelis, who I know many of you found us through. I hope we have earned you coming back to us. Please go check out that incredible interview I did with her on our YouTube channel, where she talks about mastic. It's so interesting. I learned so much. You can watch me be enthralled by her. And of course, we want to thank our friends at the Hellenic Foundation who sponsor NHM discussions. Everything we do at the National Hellenic Museum is because of the generosity of people just like you. And right now, we are in the middle of our Chairman's Challenge. Because of the generosity of our board chairman, John Calamos, every donation you make to the National Hellenic Museum through the end of the year is going to be doubled. You can do that by using this QR code or by going to our website, nationalhellenicmuseum.org. I'm also going to share a bibliography with you tomorrow, where there's going to be a few books on spices and the spice trade that you can check out if you're interested in this subject. And that will also have the link for you to come and donate. We really, really appreciate anything you can give. No gift is too small. I know that sounds cliche, but it's absolutely the truth. And it's really not too small right now, because it's going to be doubled by our Chairman's Challenge. So we really, really appreciate that. You can learn more about NHM discussions. We have all sorts of topics, not only just me, but people from scholars on a variety of topics. On Thursday at 6 p.m. Central Time, I'm going to talk about the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. We also have an online book club that meets the third Thursday of every month. That's also meeting on Thursday. We're reading Cafe Tempest this time, but book club is so much fun, and you should come to book club. If you're in the Chicagoland area, we would love to see you at our location, the heart of Chicago's historic Greek town. We can do private tours, and I'll have that information in the bibliography as well. I have had such fun tonight. I hope you have had fun. And oh, we have one last question. What was the last map? Let me find the map. Let's find what the map was. Hold on. From current slide, let's find the map. Oh, this is a map of the this is a Genoese map of the East, and they've marked in yellow what has been claimed by the Turks. That is what that is. Oh, look, the closed caption off. Once again, there's the QR code. Thank you so much for everything. Thank you for your time. It has been such a pleasure. Thank you for being the best part of my strangely good job. So thank you so much. And I will hopefully see you at another NHM discussions. See you next time and have a lovely, lovely evening wherever you are. Bye-bye.